Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio Channel. Tonight we step into a world of white silence, where the prairie stretches so far that the land seems to forget human company, and where one lonely house, no bigger than a stubborn thought, waits under a sky full of snow. What does it feel like to see the last daylight vanish when your nearest neighbour is miles away, and the wind has already begun to test the walls? What quiet truths come forward when there is nothing around you but frozen grass, dark timber, and the long work of staying warm. So before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you are here, comment below with your location and local time. Now, dim the lights. You arrive with your shoulders tight against the cold and your face half hidden in a wool scarf that smells faintly of smoke and old lanolin. Snow drifts across the open prairie in restless sheets. Not yet a full blizzard, but certainly thinking about it. The daylight is thinning into a pale grey wash, and the horizon is already dissolving where the sky and land meet. Out here, distance plays tricks. A fence post can look like a person. A cluster of shrubs can look like a barn. A small wooden house can seem both welcoming and suspicious, as though it has been sitting alone too long and has learned not to trust visitors. Your boots sink into crusted snow as you cross the yard. The path has been partly trampled, then partly erased, and your feet find it more by memory than sight. Each step gives a crisp crunch, followed by the softer squeak of powder gathering along your soles. The air bites the tip of your nose, it pinches your ears. It sneaks into the gap between mitten and coat sleeve with the boldness of an uninvited guest. Very rude. Really? Winter on the prairie has never cared much for manners. The homestead comes into clearer view through the blowing snow. It is modest, square, practical, and utterly without vanity. A short porch leans against the front. A narrow stovepipe sends a ribbon of smoke into the darkening air, and that single thread of smoke feels almost ceremonial, like proof that human life can still announce itself in a land that prefers silence. One small window glows amber. The light is soft and steady, made warmer by the frost feathering the glass at the edges. You pause by the gate and look across the flat world around you. The fields lie buried under a rough white skin. Tufts of dry prairie grass poke through in bent little arcs, rattling when the wind hits them. Farther out, a line of cottonwood stands black and motionless along a frozen creek bed. Their branches look like ink brushed across the sky. Beyond them there is only snow, distance, and the faint bluish gloom of evening. It is beautiful in a severe way. Not friendly. Beautiful anyway. You lift the latch and step through. The metal sticks slightly to your glove with a brittle cold that makes your fingers flinch. There is a smell in the yard that belongs only to winter farms. You catch dry hay, old wood, animal warmth from some hidden corner of the outbuildings, and the faint mineral scent of snow itself. Clean and sharp like stone cooled in a cellar. It is not the polished freshness people like to imagine. It is earthier than that, more honest. The house is built low against the weather, as many frontier homes were, because elegance is a luxury for people who are not regularly threatened by sideways ice. Historians generally agree that settlers on the Great Plains adapted building methods quickly, using whatever material they could get, from sawn lumber to sod bricks when timber was scarce. But scholars still debate how much these homes reflected older European traditions, and how much came from sheer local improvisation. Necessity, as ever, may have been the chief architect. You mount the porch steps, which creak under your weight with the dry complaint of aged boards. Snow has gathered in the corners and along the threshold, where it has been swept aside more than once today. The door handle is cold even through the mitten. When you open the door, warmth does not exactly rush out to greet you. Frontier warmth is too careful for that. Still, a gentler air touches your face at once, carrying the scent of burning wood, lamp oil, wool blankets, and a trace of onions lingering from some earlier meal. You step inside and close the door firmly behind you. The latch falls with a small iron click that sounds final in the deepening storm. For a moment you stand still and let the room settle around you. Your eyes adjust to the glow. A table sits near the centre, worn smooth by hands, bowls, elbows, and years of daily use. Straight-backed chairs wait around it with plain patience. Against one wall stands a cast-iron stove, black and sturdy, with a kettle murmuring softly on top. A lamplight trembles on the glass chimney, making the corners of the room seem to breathe in shadow. The boards under your boots are rough but solid. You can feel the heat near the stove, though the outer edges of the room still hold winter in their corners. That is the frontier compromise. You're not exactly warm everywhere. You're warm enough in the right places. The difference matters. You remove your gloves first, flexing stiff fingers as the ache of returning heat begins. Then the scarf comes loose, damp at the edge where your breath has frozen and melted and frozen again. Your coat is heavy with clinging snow. You hang it on a peg by the door, and as it settles, small pellets of ice drop to the floorboards and begin to shine in the lamplight. Your shoulders feel strangely light without the weight of the layers, though the cold has left a memory in your skin. There is a particular kind of quiet inside a house surrounded by snow. It is not true silence. The stove ticks as metal expands. The kettle whispers. The window gives an occasional faint tremor when a gust leans hard against the wall. Somewhere overhead a beam answers with a low, sleepy creak. Yet all those little sounds only deepen the stillness. They make you aware of the great, muffled world outside, where snow is piling against the fence and darkness is gathering over the prairie mile by mile. You move closer to the stove and hold your hands toward it. The heat licks your palms, prickly at first, then soothing. You can smell iron warm to that dry, dusty sweetness it gets after long use. Beside the stove sits a small box of split kindling, and beside that a stack of larger logs, each one precious. Fuel is never casual in a winter like this. Every stick has already been chopped, carried, stacked, and guarded from damp. Burning a fire on the frontier is not cosy decoration, it is arithmetic. On a shelf near the wall, jars catch the light. You see preserved beans, pale turnips, and dark fruit put up months ago when summer still seemed endless. A crock of lard rests under a cloth cover. There is a sack of flour folded shut and a tin of tea near the lamp. These quiet supplies tell their own story. Survival here is planned in advance, in gardens hoed under hard sun, in smokehouses, in cellars, in careful measurements. Even a peaceful evening by the stove began half a year ago. One of the more curious tidbits from prairie life is how often settlers describe the weather as if it had intentions. Diaries speak of storms stalking the plains or cold slipping through cracks like a thief. It sounds poetic now, but it was probably just accurate enough to feel worth writing down. When the wind can flatten crops, lose cattle, and freeze water solid overnight, it stops feeling like a background condition and starts acting like another resident of the place. A very unpleasant resident. Never pays rent. Constantly rattles the windows. You glance toward the single glowing window. Frost has spread thicker now, shaping itself into fern like patterns that glitter where the lamplight reaches them. Early settlers often took a grim pride in reading weather from signs like that, from halos around the moon, from the ache in old injuries, from the sound snow made underfoot. Historians know these observations were part practical experience and part inherited folk wisdom, but there is still disagreement over how reliable such signs really were. Then again, when you live far from any telegraph report and far farther from modern forecasts, even a rumour from the sky feels useful. Your boots leave wet marks near the door, so you bend to pull them off. The leather is stiff from cold, your socks, thick and hand-knitted, are dry enough, and you wiggle your toes with private gratitude. Few pleasures are as underrated as dry feet in winter. No poems are written about them. A shame, honestly. Whole civilizations may have rested on the miracle of decent socks. Now that you are still, you begin to feel the day in your body. The ride here was long. The cold demanded constant tension in your back and neck. Even your jaw is tired from clenching against the wind. You lower yourself into the chair nearest the stove, and the simple act of sitting feels luxurious. The seat is hard, but it is steady. The wood is faintly warm on one side where the stove has reached it for hours. You rest your hands in your lap and listen. Outside, The storm is no longer guessing. It has started in earnest. Wind brushes the house, then pushes harder, then whistles through some narrow seam with a thin, reedy note. Snow taps the window like fingers, far off. You think you hear a loose board or shutter striking an uneven rhythm. The sound fades, then comes back. Out on the plains, nothing arrives gently for long. A small Bible lies on the table beside a pair of spectacles, and next to it sits an almanac with worn corners. The almanac was a frontier favourite for good reason. It offered weather lore, planting dates, sunrise times, bits of advice, and enough practical certainty to make a household feel slightly less alone. Many homesteads relied on them, although the confidence people placed in their forecasts varied wildly. Some readers treated them almost like science. Others treated them more like hopeful gossip printed on paper. The lamp flame sways lightly as another gust touches the walls. You study the room in detail now that you've stopped moving. A braided rug covers part of the floor, its colours muted by use. A wash basin stands on a small cabinet. Pegs hold aprons, hats, and a heavy shawl. In the corner rests a cradle, empty at the moment, its curved runners still. That little cradle reminds you how common large families were on the frontier, not only from custom but from labour needs, and the brutal reality that not every child survived to adulthood. It is one of the quieter facts of homestead life, and one of the saddest, though this room itself speaks less of sorrow than of endurance. The atmosphere grows thicker with evening. Lamplight becomes the whole world indoors, gilding the table edge, the stove lid, the handle of a cup. Beyond its reach, shadows gather softly, never quite threatening, simply waiting. The warmth on your face contrasts with the cool air at your back. Your skin notices both at once. It is an intimate sensation, this half comfort, half exposure. It makes you aware of the house as shelter rather than abstraction. You rise at last and move toward the window, wiping a patch of glass with the side of your hand. The frost smears, then clears. Outside, snow crosses the yard in slanting silver lines. The shed is almost obscured. The fence nearest the house remains visible, though the farther posts are vanishing one by one into white dusk. The prairie seems to be erasing itself. You feel very small standing there, and oddly calm because of it. Out here, self-importance does not survive long. The weather cures you of that. You rest your fingertips against the cold pane for one brief second, then pull them back quickly. The glass is bitter. It burns with cold. Yet the lamp behind you glows steadily. The kettle still murmurs, and the stove continues its patient work. In that contrast lies the whole meaning of a frontier homestead. Not comfort without effort, not safety without risk. Simply a fragile pocket of order held against a world that is wider, colder, and older than you are. Night settles fully over the prairie. The house gives a soft creak as the temperature drops again. Somewhere outside, the wind changes direction and begins sweeping snow against the north wall with a dry, rushing hiss. You stand in the warm lamp glow, wrapped now in stillness, smoke scent, and the faint rustle of your own breath, while the lonely homestead braces itself for the long winter dark. The door is barred for the night, and the house settles into its own private weather. Outside, the storm has the whole prairie to command. Inside, every object seems enlisted in a quieter campaign. Nothing here is decorative by accident. The room is small enough that lamplight can reach most of it, yet large enough for cold to lurk in the corners like a patient cat. You stand near the stove and begin to see the place properly, not as a shelter glimpsed in relief, but as a system of choices, habits, and hard lessons shaped into wood and iron. The stove is the centre of that little universe. It is cast iron, broad-bellied, practical, blackened by years of soot and handling. Its door closes with a firm metal bite. Its legs grip the floor as if even it expects the wind to try something clever. You lift the kettle and hear the lid tap softly. Steam curls up in a ghostly ribbon, carrying the warm scent of metal and boiled water. The heat is dry on your cheeks. It draws the sting from your face and the stiffness from your fingers. though your back still feels a faint chill each time the wind leans at the walls. Frontier families depended on stoves like this for almost everything. They boiled water, cooked meals, dried mittens, warmed bricks for beds, heated flat irons, and sometimes baked bread, all in one heroic day. Historians generally agree that the arrival of efficient iron stoves transformed domestic life across North America, especially in harsher climates. Yet scholars still disagree on how quickly remote households adopted them, because transport was slow, cash was scarce, and many families made do with older hearth methods much longer than advertisements like to admit. Fancy catalogue promises melt quickly in a real blizzard. You crouch to inspect the wood box beside the stove. The split logs are stacked with more care than generosity. The bark is pale where the axe has bitten through. Small curls of kindling rest in a basket, each piece dry and light enough to catch easily. You can smell resin, an old sap under the smoke. Wood on the prairie was never something to squander. In treeless districts, settlers burned twisted roots, cornstalks, hay, dried animal dung, or whatever else would catch and hold a flame. That practical detail tends to disappear from romantic paintings, probably because no one ever thought a graceful portrait of a dung fire would sell very well. Near the stove hangs a line with damp woolens laid over it, mittens, thick socks, and a scarf are steaming gently, each giving off that dense, slightly sheepish smell of wet wool. It is not elegant, but it is reassuring. The touch of those garments would be rough against the fingertips, the fibres swollen from melted snow, the heat slowly working through them. Out here, clothing is not merely worn, it is managed, repaired, layered, aired, dried, and treated with the seriousness some people reserve for heirlooms. A peg rail runs along the wall, on it hang coats patched at elbows, aprons faded by wash water, and a bonnet with a crushed ribbon that has long since stopped pretending to be pretty. You brush the sleeve of one coat and feel the firm weave of homespun cloth. There is a stubborn dignity in fabric like this. It was often spun, cut, and mended by hand, then used until the idea of replacement became almost comic. A torn cuff might become a strip for binding, a worn dress might become a child's garment might become a cleaning rag. The frontier disliked waste with a near-religious intensity. The floorboards tell their own story under your feet. They are uneven, worn smooth in pathways between stove, table, bed, and door. The grain rises in places like old scars. There are gaps slim enough to catch a draught and wide enough to remind you that houses were built by hands, not by machines pursuing perfection. Some settlers stuffed such cracks with rags, moss, newspaper, or clay. Others simply learned where not to stand in stocking feet. The cold finds every floor eventually. It is an excellent inspector. You move toward the window and study the thick curtain pulled halfway across it. The fabric is plain, a little stiff with age, and heavier than city curtains would ever bother to be. That extra weight matters. So does the strip of cloth rolled and pressed along the sill to block drafts. So do the shutters outside when there are shutters. So does the careful chinking between boards. A winter house survives by inches. One loose seam can waste fuel all night long. One careless gap can turn a room from merely cool to bitterly unfriendly by dawn. On the table sits a lamp with a glass chimney and a broad reservoir for kerosene. The flame inside it is modest and steady, not bright enough to banish every shadow, yet bright enough for sewing, reading, and the difficult business of not feeling abandoned by the dark. Earlier generations relied on candles dipped from tallow, and some households still did when supplies ran low. A kerosene lamp, though, meant cleaner light and more dependable evenings, provided someone remembered to trim the wick and clean the soot. Even light requires maintenance here. Nothing simply behaves on its own. You look up and see bunches of herbs hanging from the rafters, sage, perhaps, and mint, maybe a little thyme gone brittle with drying. Their smell lingers faintly beneath the stronger scents of wood smoke and lamp oil. The bundles sway just enough to show the house is not perfectly still. Prairie women often dried herbs for cooking, teas, and home remedies. Some uses were practical, some inherited, and some rested on the kind of conviction that thrives when doctors are distant and winter roads are worse than useless. Historians can identify the common plants, but the exact household recipes often vanished with the people who trusted them. Against one wall stands a bedstead with a rope, or slat support under a piled mattress. You press the quilt with your hand and feel the uneven loft of filling shifted by long use. The coverlet is stitched in small, careful patterns, not because anyone had spare hours to play at beauty, but because making things plain and durable did not prevent making them lovely. The quilt has weight to it. You can imagine the pressure of it over your legs on a night when frost rims the inside of the window. A warm bed on the frontier was an engineering project in cloth. There is a bed warmer tucked partly beneath the frame, a long-handled pan once used to carry embers between the sheets before sleep. It sounds luxurious until you remember the risk of scorching linens or setting the whole arrangement alight, which rather spoils the coziness. People also heated bricks and wrapped them in cloth, or slept in caps, scarves, and layers of wool. Some accounts mention family members sharing a bed not only from affection or lack of space, but because human warmth was too useful to ignore. Romance is well and good. Survival is usually busier. A wooden chest sits at the foot of the bed. Its lid is scarred from use, and its hinges squeak when you raise it. Inside are folded linens, a spare shirt, a shawl, and a packet of letters tied with ribbon. The scent that rises is cedar, soap, and thyme. Chests like this protected the household's softer wealth from dust, mice, damp, and careless handling. In a place where money might be scarce and stores far away, cloth itself was capital. A sound blanket, a strong pair of sheets, a bolt of fabric, these could feel as valuable as silver. By the washstand rests a basin with a thin rim of chill around its edge. The pitcher beside it is heavy earthenware, cool to the touch even in this room. Washing in winter demanded nerve and discipline. Water had to be hauled, melted, or pumped, then often warmed on the stove in careful portions. Personal cleanliness did not vanish on the frontier, despite old jokes, but it adapted to conditions that made every cup of hot water earn its reputation. There is a kind of a heroism in deciding to wash your face when the room itself seems to disapprove. Above the basin hangs a small mirror. The glass has tiny waves in it, enough to soften a reflection at the edges. Your face in it looks slightly dreamlike, the lamplight gilding one cheek while the other slips into shadow. Homemade or early commercial mirrors could be imperfect, and yet they mattered. They let people pin collars straight, trim hair, shave carefully, and maintain some stubborn standard of presentation. Even isolated households kept up forms of order. Civilization, it turns out, is often a comb, a basin, and the refusal to surrender entirely to chaos. The table drawers contain things that seem ordinary until you understand how necessary each one is. Needles wrapped in paper, a thimble gone smooth inside, twine, buttons saved from garments beyond rescue, beeswax, a blunt pencil, a bit of chalk, a folded receipt, a packet of seeds waiting for a season that feels impossible tonight. You roll one button between finger and thumb. It is cool, polished, and slightly nicked at the edge. Useful things gather quietly in homes like this, each one small, each one capable of solving a problem that would otherwise become absurdly large. In one corner sits a spinning wheel, partly draped with cloth. Its presence gives the room a different kind of silence, the silence of labour paused rather than absent. You imagine the low whir of the wheel, the pull of fibre through practised fingers, the treadle tapping a calm rhythm on the floor. Not every homestead spun its own yarn, and by the later 19th century factory cloth was more available in many regions. Still, home production remained common, especially where money or transport was tight. Scholars still argue how much spinning survived from necessity and how much from habit, thrift or pride. Probably all four, with a little stubbornness added for flavour. A Bible, an almanac, and a school primer rest on a narrow shelf, their pages swollen slightly by years of use and damp seasons. Books on the frontier were treasured partly because they were useful, and partly because they offered company of a sort. Reading by lamplight could turn a winter evening into something wider than weather and chores. The primer especially catches your attention. Education in remote areas was irregular, often interrupted by work, distance, and harsh conditions, but many households guarded books with astonishing care. A child might outgrow a coat, but not the value of letters. You run your hand along the wall and feel the roughness of whitewashed boards. The surface is cool in some places, faintly warmer near the stove side. Whitewash itself served more than vanity. It brightened dim rooms, helped cover soot, and had a reputation for cleanliness. Nothing in this house is grand, yet everything tries to earn its place. Even the pale wall is working. Even the rag rug is insulating. Even the rocking chair by the fire has a purpose beyond sentiment, useful for mending, nursing, reading, and the occasional exhausted stare into the stove when words have quite reasonably failed. Then there are the sounds. The house speaks constantly once you start listening closely enough. The stove ticks and settles. The lamp hums with a faint invisible heat. Wind scrapes a handful of snow across the outer boards. A ladle in the crock shifts with a tiny clink as the table trembles. Somewhere a mouse perhaps considers its options behind the wainscot. The atmosphere is intimate and watchful. You can hear how thin the boundary is between shelter and storm, and how much skill is hidden inside that boundary. One odd frontier tidbit still surfaces in memoirs and local lore. Some households kept a cat less for companionship than as a formal declaration of war against mice, which could ruin grain, gnaw cloth, and turn a calm pantry into a furry scandal. A good mouser might be praised almost like hired help. You glance toward the shadow by the cupboard and half expect a pair of eyes to blink back. In a practical house, even affection often arrives with job duties. The cupboard itself is stout and plain. When you open it, the hinges complain softly, and the smell inside is a mix of flour dust, dried apples, salt pork, and wood polish. Plates are stacked carefully. Tin cups nest together. A crock of pickles sits at the back, guarded by its own sharp scent. There is no excess here, yet there is planning. You notice how everything is arranged for reach, for preservation, for habit. The hand knows where to go in the dark because the mind has rehearsed the pattern 100 nights. By now the room no longer seems spare, it seems crowded with intelligence. Each peg, quilt, and kettle records a decision made against discomfort. Each repaired seam says someone refused defeat in a quiet domestic form. The storm outside can batter the walls all it likes. It may even win a few small arguments by dawn. But inside this room, human beings have prepared their reply in iron, cloth, cedar, flame, and patience. You stand again by the stove and feel the warmth press against your shins. The kettle lid gives one soft rattle. Lamplight shines over the patched sleeve hanging by the door, over the braided rug, over the folded quilt waiting with its heavy promise. The whole little house seems to hold itself upright not by strength alone, but by use. That may be the most frontier thing of all. Nothing survives here by accident. It survives because someone learned exactly what winter demands and then answered it with both hands. You do not get to admire a winter evening for long on the prairie. The house may be warm in patches and steady under the lamp, but the hour before full night belongs to work. It always does. Outside, the storm is busy arranging itself into a more serious mood, and that means every small task must be done while hands still obey. Light still exists, and the yard has not vanished completely beneath drifting snow. You pull your coat back on, still a little damp at the shoulders, and the fabric greets you with a chill that feels almost personal. Your scarf goes round your neck again. Mittens follow. The stove heat leaves your skin too quickly, as though warmth never truly trusts the open air. At the door you pause, listening. Wind rubs along the boards with a dry hiss. Something loose knocks once, then falls silent. The latch lifts. The cold reaches in at once. Outside, the prairie has sharpened into a harder kind of evening. Snow no longer falls straight. It moves sideways in pale ribbons, twisting over the yard and sweeping low across the ground. The sky is a deep iron grey, and the last residue of daylight clings weakly along the horizon. Your breath turns to mist before your face, then disappears. The porch steps are slicker now. Snow has drifted into their corners again, as if the weather has been patiently undoing human effort between each glance. The first job is the water. it is always the water. Frontier life runs on it, and winter tries constantly to hide it, thicken it, or turn it into a stubborn block that must be negotiated like an enemy. You take the yoke and pails from beside the porch. The wood is smooth where hands have polished it over years, but the metal rims sting even through your mittens. Each pail gives a hollow clank when lifted. Empty, for now, not for long. The well stands a short way from the house, and the path to it is partly marked by old footprints frozen beneath newer snow. You walk carefully, boots sinking with a crisp, compact sound. Under the top layer, the ground is harder, packed by repeated use. A lantern hangs from your hand and swings gently, throwing warm circles over the whitened yard. Fence posts appear, then dim again. The shed looms to one side, black and squat beneath its gathering cap of snow. Wells on isolated homesteads could be blessings, disappointments, or outright practical jokes from geology. Some were shallow and temperamental, some turned brackish, some froze at the worst possible hour, just to add drama. Historians broadly agree that securing reliable water was one of the greatest challenges for prairie settlers, especially in the early years when infrastructure was absent and local conditions varied wildly. Yet scholars still debate how much families depended on wells versus creeks, hauled barrels, snowmelt, or cooperative arrangements with neighbours. The answer changed from county to county, and sometimes from month to month. You reach the well house and pull the door open. Inside, the air is even colder somehow, the still kind of cold that sits low and deep. The rope is stiff. The pulley gives a tired squeal. You lower the bucket and hear it descend into darkness. Then the delayed splash from below. That sound, small and distant, is one of the most reassuring in the world out here. You haul steadily, bracing your boots, feeling the wet weight rise through your arms and shoulders. When the bucket clears the lip, water sloshes silver in the lantern glow, dark and clear and precious. You pour carefully into the pails. A little spills over your mitten. Instantly the cold bites through the wool and starts thinking about ice. Very efficient. Winter, a terrible host, but extremely organised. You fill both pails and hook them onto the yoke. The weight settles across your shoulders with an honest heavy pull. Water does not let you pretend it is light. Each step back to the house demands balance. The liquid rocks softly. A rim taps against the wood with each careful stride. By the time you reach the porch, your arms and neck already feel the strain. Inside again, you set the pails by the stove to keep them from skimming over too quickly. A little steam rises from the nearest one. Some water will be heated for washing, some for tea, some kept ready in case the storm worsens and outside work becomes impossible for a while. In winter, abundance is often just a few full buckets within arm's reach. There is no time yet to sit. The animals need tending before the dark seals everything up. You take a grain scoop, pull on the gloves once more and head toward the barn. The wind is louder now, pressing against your ears in long cold breaths. Snow rasps along the side of the house and swirls over the yard in chasing loops. The lantern flame jumps but holds. Your boots find the packed route by habit as much as sight. The barn is not large, but in weather like this it feels immense with purpose. When you open the door, a wave of animal heat rolls outward, rich with hay, manure, leather, and the sweet dusty smell of stored feed. Compared with the air outside, it is almost luxurious. Horses shift in their stalls. A cow turns her head and exhales a slow cloud into the lantern light. Chickens murmur from their roosts with the sleepy, sceptical sounds of creatures who never approved of winter and have no intention of starting now. You begin with the horse. Its coat is thick and slightly damp along the flank where old warmth meets new cold. You run a hand down its neck, feeling the solid muscle under winter hair. The animal leans subtly into the touch, then stamps once, impatient for grain. You tip feed into the manger. The sound is immediate and satisfying. A dry rattling paw followed by the eager crunch of eating. You check the water bucket, break the thin ice that has formed across the top, and refill what you can. That brief skin of ice is a frontier insult repeated daily. Cattle were central to many prairie households, though the exact mix of animals varied by region, wealth, and ambition. A milk cow in particular could mean the difference between thin subsistence and a steadier household diet. Butter, cream, and buttermilk all had their places, but keeping stock alive through severe winters was not simple. Historians know storms could kill animals in shocking numbers when feed ran short or shelter failed. There is still disagreement, though, about how often small homesteads truly manage diversified stock successfully, since diaries and county records tend to highlight both unusual triumphs and spectacular disasters more than ordinary middling results. The cow receives hay, then a little mash, and regards you with that broad solemn expression cattle wear so well. She smells of warm hide and silage, earthy and calm. Her breath is damp on the air. You check the latch on her stall, then move to the chickens. Their coop corner is dim and feather soft, full of shifting bodies and the dry smell of grain dust. You scatter feed, beaks click, wings rustle. One hen gives you a look suggesting profound disappointment in your timing, your footwear, and perhaps your entire management philosophy. A small basket under the nesting shelf holds 2 eggs, surprisingly warm under your fingers. Finding eggs in winter always feels slightly miraculous, as if the hens have decided to participate in civilization after all. You tuck them into a pocket lined with cloth. Frontier eggs were not guaranteed daily treasures once daylight shortened and cold set in, unless a household took pains with feed, shelter, and sometimes artificial light later on. Here, any winter egg is a quiet little gift. You fork down more hay from the loft hatch. Dust rises in the lantern beam, pale gold against the dark. It smells dry, grassy, and faintly summery. A memory of cut fields preserved above the animals' heads. Feed storage was one of the great winter calculations. Too little hay and stock weakened fast. Too much optimism and a family might discover in February that confidence is not edible. One quirky detail from settler accounts is how often people judged a neighbour's competence by the shape and condition of the haystack. It was less gossip than agricultural character study. The barn door must be secured next. You test the hinges, then the bar. Snow has begun to creep along the threshold in fine white fingers. You kick it clear. Wind squeezes through a seam with a low whistle. It is impossible to make a building perfectly tight, but you can make it stubborn. That often has to do. Back outside, the cold feels sharper after the animal warmth. You head for the wood pile, lantern swinging at your side. The stack stands near the shed under a sloping cover, and you are relieved to see the tarp still holding. A frontier evening without enough firewood would turn philosophical in the worst way. You pull several split logs free. Their edges are rough against your gloves, their weight dense and satisfying. You carry one armload to the porch, then another. By the time the second load lands beside the door, your breath is harsh in your chest and snow has collected on your hat brim and shoulders. Woodcutting itself belonged to another hour and often another season, but handling the supply was daily business. Families stacked wood for dryness, convenience, and survival, and some kept separate piles for quick kindling, steady hardwood, and whatever poor material had to be burned when better choices ran out. In treeless prairie areas, settlers sometimes planted shelter belts and groves partly with future fuel in mind. The foresight involved is easy to admire from a comfortable chair. Much harder when you're digging post holes in hard ground under a summer sun with mosquitoes conducting military exercises around your head. There is one more chore in the yard. You make your way to the privy path with a shovel and scrape drifting snow aside so it can still be found in the dark. A glamorous frontier detail this is not, but realism has its own dignity. Winter turned every outdoor necessity into a test of resolve. Some families used chamber pots overnight simply to avoid exposing themselves to lethal cold, especially during storms. No painting of heroic settlement life ever lingers much on that fact. Curious omission. By now the light is nearly gone. The storm has swallowed what remained of the horizon. House, barn, shed, and fence seem to float in separate islands of lantern glow, with darkness and blowing snow between them. Sound travels strangely. A horse snorts from inside the barn. The wind dances along the eaves. Somewhere a loose chain knocks metal against wood in an uneven little rhythm. The whole homestead feels alive, but in a modest and hard-working way. You return indoors for good and shut the door with a firm shoulder. At once the indoor smells gather around you again. Smoke, wool, warm iron, the slight sour sweetness of rising dough from somewhere under cloth, the earthy scent of root vegetables stored nearby. Your eyelashes are damp with melted snow, your cheeks sting. You set the lantern down and begin shedding layers carefully, so nothing precious ends up too close to the stove or puddling across the floor. The eggs come out of your pocket and are placed gently in a bowl. The wood is stacked within reach of the fire. You add 2 logs to the stove and hear the low, eager crackle as flame catches at bark and split grain. The sound is deeply comforting, not dramatic, just competent. Heat begins building again, a steady persuasion rather than a sudden triumph. There are tools to put right before supper can even be considered. The yolk goes to its peg, the scoop is brushed off and returned to the bin. Mittens are hung to dry. Wet boots are turned near, but not too near. The stove. Practical order matters because tomorrow will demand the same things again, and confusion in a small house multiplies faster than it should. A misplaced glove can waste 10 irritable minutes. A lost match can insult an entire evening. You wipe the table, check the flour sack, and lift the cloth over a bowl where dough rests in quiet patience. Bread making on the frontier was routine, but never trivial. Flour quality varied. Yeast might be saved, shared, coaxed, or replaced by sour starters and other improvisations. Some households baked daily, some less often, depending on fuel, schedule, and appetite. Historians can describe general patterns, though household rhythms remain a little elusive because ordinary success rarely inspired anyone to write. Bread turned out acceptably again. No poetry required. At the washstand, you pour a little warmed water into the basin and scrub your hands. The water clouds with dust from wood, feed, and stable work. Your skin feels raw from the cold and roughened by labour. The towel is coarse but clean. Dry hands, clean hands, ready hands, small mercies. Then, finally, the chores loosen their grip. The animals are fed. Water stands ready. Firewood waits by the stove. The yard has been answered for one more night. Outside, the storm continues its sweeping campaign over the dark prairie, piling snow against fence and wall with tireless indifference. Inside, your body carries the honest fatigue of completed work. Your shoulders ache. Your palms are warm at last. The room hums softly around you in lamplight and stove heat, prepared now for the quieter rituals of evening. You draw a breath that seems deeper than any before it. The house feels earned. With the outdoor work finished, the room changes character. It no longer feels like a place you have passed through in haste. It becomes a place that can hold an evening. The lamp glows with a steadier warmth now, and the stove gives off that dry, enveloping heat that seems to settle first in your knees and then, gradually, in your bones. Your coat hangs by the door, slowly releasing the last of the storm into the air. A faint wet wool smell lingers near it, but near the table there is already another promise forming. Supper begins with small sounds, the scrape of a chair, the soft thump of a crock set on the table, the lid of the stove lifting with a low iron clink, a spoon tapping the side of a pot. In a city kitchen these noises might disappear into a larger hum of life, but here they stand clearly apart, each one crisp in the close evening air. Even hunger seems quieter on the prairie. It arrives not as a complaint, but as a deep, steady pull, the body calmly reminding you that labour has made a claim. You open the cupboard and consider the choices with frontier realism. There is no theatrical abundance here, no pyramids of fruit, no glossy cakes awaiting applause. What there is, though, is enough, and enough means more than it sounds like. A jar of beans, salt pork wrapped in cloth, a crock of pickles with their sharp sour perfume, potatoes kept from freezing by patience and luck, onions, flour, a heel of cheese, a little molasses, dried apples in a tin. The 2 eggs from the barn rest in a bowl like small pale rewards. The meal will be plain, and that plainness has its own authority. You set a pot on the stove and begin with bacon fat already saved in a crock, because on the frontier very little was thrown away if it could flavour another day. It softens in the heat, then melts with a low shimmer. The smell rises at once. rich and savoury, almost luxurious in the little room. You chop onion on the board. The knife makes a steady hollow rhythm against the wood. The pieces go into the pot and begin to sizzle, turning translucent at the edges, sweetening as they cook. There is something deeply calming about practical cooking. One task follows the next with no need for performance. Potatoes are peeled in long, rough curls. Beans are drained and added. A small piece of salt pork is cut fine to stretch its flavour farther. A pinch of salt, a touch of pepper if any remains in the tin, perhaps a bit of dried herb from the rafters. The pot begins to speak in soft, bubbling noises. Steam touches your face when you lean over it. It smells of earth, smoke, and salt. A fragrance built more for comfort than glory. Frontier meals were shaped less by taste alone than by climate, distance, storage, and labour. Historians broadly agree that daily food on isolated homesteads was repetitive by modern standards, especially in winter, when fresh produce vanished and preserved staples took over. Yet scholars still argue about just how monotonous these diets really were, because diaries often highlight feast days and shortages. While ordinary suppers went undescribed, the truth was probably somewhere in between. Not endless misery, not culinary splendour, just a great deal of beans, bread, pork, and determination. You turn to the bread. The risen dough waits beneath its cloth, domed and faintly warm near the stove. When you press it lightly, the surface gives with a slow resilience, leaving a dent that lifts halfway back. A living thing in its modest way. You dust the board with flour and tip the dough out. It lands with a soft, satisfying weight. Your hands work automatically now, folding, pressing, shaping. The dough feels smooth in some places, tacky in others, and the flour dries your fingertips to a pale powder. Bread on the frontier could be leavened or not, white or brown, soft or dense enough to settle disagreements by impact alone. In some regions, cornmeal shared the burden with wheat. In others, biscuits appeared when yeast failed or time was tight. One quirky tidbit from old household accounts is how proudly some cooks judged loaves by the sound they made when tapped. A good crust had its own note, apparently. Entire reputations may have rested on a hollow knock and a decent rise. Civilization is stranger than it looks. You set a loaf into a pan and slide it toward the hotter side of the stove oven, or into a Dutch oven, depending on what the household uses tonight. The arrangement is less precise than modern cooking, but not careless. Heat must be read by instinct, by experience, by how quickly flour browns or how fiercely the iron lid warms your hand when hovered near it. A frontier cook develops a relationship with temperature that is half knowledge and half intimate suspicion. The stove is useful, but not entirely trustworthy. You keep an eye on it. The eggs are cracked into a bowl with a small, clean snap. Their yolks sit bright and rich against the tin. You beat them with a fork and pour them into a greased pan. They thicken quickly on the stove, curds forming in soft folds. The smell is mild and buttery from the fat, and suddenly the room feels less like a place under siege from weather, and more like a place where human beings fully intend to enjoy themselves within reason. Modest reason. Still, enjoyment counts. On the table you set out crockery one piece at a time. A plate with a hairline crack. A bowl with a blue edge worn thin from washing. Tin cups. A jar of preserves brought out almost ceremonially, because sweetness in winter carries more emotional importance than it does in June. A folded cloth. A spoon for each place. The gestures are simple, but they turn labour into an evening. A table laid properly says that hunger will be answered with some dignity. Even if the answer is mostly potatoes, the bread begins to bake, and its scent gathers slowly, patiently, until it seems to enter the room from every side. Warm flour, yeast, crust, the faint toasted note of browning edges. Few smells are more persuasive. You can feel your own body respond to it. Bread has that effect. It seems to calm one part of the mind while sharpening another. Some deep ancient corner of the human creature hears that smell and decides the world may continue for one more night. While the pot simmers, you stir a pan of dried apples with a little water and molasses. They swell and soften in the heat, turning glossy and fragrant. The scent is darker than fresh fruit, a little smoky, a little sweet, with the memory of summer hidden inside it. Preserved fruit was a small triumph of planning, especially in harsh districts where orchards were uncertain or young. Drying, canning, and cellaring carried warm months forward into winter in the most literal way possible. You can taste foresight in a spoonful of stewed apples. At times like this, the house seems to breathe with you. The stove exhales warmth, the lamp flame narrows, then steadies, a pot lid gives a tiny shiver. Outside, wind brushes the wall in a long cold sweep, but indoors the scents of onion, bread, and pork deepen, claiming the air inch by inch. The contrast is so strong you can feel it on your skin. Your face is warm, your ankles remain cool, your hands smell of dough and smoke. There are worse ways to be alive. You take a knife and cut a little cheese, sharp enough to wake the tongue, crumbly at the edge where the winter air has dried it slightly. Cheese was a valued food on many homesteads because it stored reasonably well and added fat and protein to meals that might otherwise lean too heavily on starch. Yet household production varied enormously. Some families made butter and cheese regularly, others traded for them when possible. Historians can trace the broad patterns, but the daily practice remains patchy in the record, hidden inside kitchens that did not think themselves important enough for posterity. Posterity, naturally, is often wrong about such things. The loaf is ready. You know it by colour first, then by smell, then by the careful tap that gives back a hollow answer. You draw it out and set it to cool, though not for long. Steam escapes from a split in the crust. The top is browned, the sides a little paler where the pan protected them. When you cut it, the knife meets resistance, then sinks through with a soft tearing sound. The crumb inside is tender and hot, and a cloud of fragrant steam rises straight up into the lamplight. Butter, if there is butter, softens almost at once on the first thick slice. If there is only drippings or lard, that will do perfectly well too. Hunger is an excellent editor of expectations. You ladle the bean and potato stew into bowls. The liquid is thick, the onions melting into it, the pieces of pork small but meaningful. The eggs are portioned beside it. Pickles add a sharpness that cuts the richness. Stewed apples wait at the edge of the table as a quiet reward. Then at last you sit. The chair feels harder now that your body has cooled from work. Yet the table draws you close to the stove and lamp, and the whole arrangement gathers into a circle of comfort. You wrap your hands around the bowl first, not even to eat yet, just to feel the heat through the pottery. It warms your palms and fingertips with a deep, satisfying steadiness. Steam touches your face. The first spoonful is almost too hot, but you take it anyway and feel the salt, starch, and fat settle through you like a kind instruction. A simple frontier supper could be astonishingly restorative. Modern imagination sometimes pictures settlers dining in constant heroic misery, nobly gnawing despair beside empty shelves. The reality was both duller and nicer. Much of the time they ate ordinary sustaining food, and when that food was hot after a cold evening, it probably tasted magnificent. Not because it was rare cuisine, but because appetite, labour, and weather had all collaborated to make it so. The finer seasoning remains necessity, a rude fact, but true. You eat slowly. Bread is torn and dipped. Pickles are bitten between spoonfuls, their vinegar brightness making your mouth wake up again. The eggs are soft and rich. The stew is humble, but it fills every empty place left by the day. With each mouthful, the strain in your shoulders seems to soften. The room grows gentler. Even the storm outside sounds less hostile when listened to on a full stomach. There is also tea, or perhaps coffee if supplies have allowed it, though many remote households measured such luxuries carefully. Tea was often stretched, reused, or blended with herbs. Coffee too could be eked out with ingenuity that modern drinkers might consider emotional sabotage. Roasted grains, chicory, and other substitutes entered the pot when necessity ruled. One frontier anecdote claims that a truly desperate brew could strip paint from a wagon. This may be unfair to the brew, it may also be generous. Tonight, perhaps. You pour hot tea into a cup and watch the surface tremble in the light. The scent is faint but welcome. You wrap both hands around it after the meal, letting warmth soak into your fingers again. Drinking something hot in a storm feels almost ceremonial. It marks the shift from toil to rest, from the outer world to the inner one. A cup by lamplight can carry more peace than a grand banquet in a room without gratitude. There is no hurry now. You scrape the bowl clean with the last piece of bread. Crumbs gather on the plate. The stewed apples are eaten slowly, their sweetness low and mellow, the molasses lending depth rather than brightness. Dessert in such a place need not be extravagant. It only needs to remind you that pleasure is not forbidden just because life is difficult. Afterward, the table holds that pleasant disorder that follows a satisfying meal. A knife laid down at an angle, a spoon with a streak of apple left on it, a cup half empty, lamplight resting on the rim of the bowl. The room smells richly of baked bread, cooked onion, and tea leaves, with smoke underneath it all. Outside, snow continues to move over the prairie in vast indifferent sweeps. But inside the stove glows, the dishes wait, and your body rests in the small, solid happiness of being fed. You rise eventually to wash the plates in warmed water from the stove. The task is quiet, almost meditative. Crockery clinks softly. Steam curls from the basin. The cloth in your hand grows warm and heavy. Cleaning up after supper is part of the meal's conclusion, not an interruption of it. Order is restored. The loaf is wrapped. Leftovers are covered. Cups are turned upright to dry. Even the crumbs are gathered, because waste has no welcome here. When the last dish is set aside, you pause by the stove and look around the room. The air is warm with food and fire. Your hands are clean again. Your stomach is comfortably full, your eyelids slightly heavier, your breathing slower. In this lonely homestead, under the pressure of a winter storm, supper has done what it always does at its best. It has made the house feel not merely occupied, but lived in. Darkness fully takes the prairie now. Not the gentle dusk that lingers politely over softer landscapes, but a complete winter dark that seems to arrive with weight and purpose. The little homestead stands in it like a lantern forgotten in a field, one warm square of human insistence surrounded by miles of moving black and white. Inside, the bowls have been dried and put away, the loaf wrapped, the table cleared to its plain usefulness again. The room feels tidier, quieter, and somehow more alert, as though the house itself has noticed what the weather is becoming. The first strong blow of the storm hits the north wall with a force that makes the lamp flame quiver. It is not a dramatic crash. It is worse than that. It is a long, pressing shove, a wide, cold hand laid against the boards. Snow rasps across the outside in a dry rush. The window gives a tiny rattle. A spoon left on the shelf trembles once, then stills. You lift your head and listen closely. The house answers with a faint creak from the rafters and a low complaint from somewhere in the floor, like an old animal settling its bones. Wind on the open prairie has room to think. That is what makes it feel different here. In forests, weather is broken up by trunks and branches. In towns, buildings interfere, fences interrupt, corners catch and divert. But out here the storm gathers itself over long, clear distances and arrives with uninterrupted confidence. It does not merely pass through, it occupies. You move to the window and wipe a small circle in the frost with the heel of your hand. The pane is so cold it almost burns. Outside, the yard is barely visible. The fence nearest the house appears and disappears behind blowing sheets of snow. The barn has become a darker shadow within darkness. The sky is not black, exactly. It glows with a strange stormlight, pale and thick and depthless, as if the whole night has been filled with ground glass. Blizzards on the North American plains earned their reputation honestly. Historians broadly agree that winter storms were among the greatest dangers settlers faced, not only because of cold itself, but because visibility could vanish in minutes and familiar ground became disorienting. Yet historians still dispute how much later memory exaggerated certain storms into legend, since newspaper reports, memoirs, and oral accounts often turned hardship into moral theatre. Still, even the plainest record is severe enough. People lost roads, livestock, fingers, and sometimes entire lives within inside of home. A gust hits harder than the last. The shutter knocks once. The chimney draws with a different sound now, a low hollow note that rises and falls as the wind changes angle. You step back from the window and glance up toward the ceiling as if you can read the weather in the beams. The house seems steady, but it no longer feels separate from the storm. It feels engaged with it, answering each shove with its own quiet resistance. You check the door bar first. Your fingers wrap around the wood, smooth from use and slightly warm at the centre where indoor air has touched it. Secure. Then you inspect the curtain at the window and pull it fully across. The heavy fabric falls with a soft whisper. It helps with drafts. But more than that, it shuts out the unnerving sight of the storm erasing the yard. There are moments when not seeing is a kind of comfort. Near the hearth side of the stove, you add another log. The new wood catches slowly, then begins to crackle along the split edges. Sparks flash briefly behind the iron door before disappearing. Heat strengthens at your shins. The room smells of sap, warmed soot, and the fading remains of supper. Fire at such an hour is not decorative. It is reassurance made visible. One of the stranger details preserved in frontier recollections is how often people claimed they could tell a storm's temper by its voice against the house. A soft brushing meant dry snow. A hiss meant finer grains. A heavy thudding at one wall meant drifting. Whether these distinctions were meteorology or just intimacy with discomfort is hard to say. Scholars still argue how much environmental knowledge settlers truly developed, versus how much they believed they had developed because confidence itself was useful. Either way, when you live with a house this small, you learn its language quickly. The lamp has to be adjusted. Wind pressure changes the room in tiny ways, and the flame begins to smoke at the chimney. You trim the wick a touch and lower it slightly. The smell of hot kerosene sharpens, then settles. Better. A lamp in a storm is a surprisingly emotional thing. Its glow reaches over the table, touches the cupboard latch, warms the whitewashed wall, and leaves the corners dim but not abandoned. The flame says that order continues, however modestly. You sit for a moment in the rocking chair by the stove. The wood gives a small familiar groan as it takes your weight, back and forth, back and forth. The motion is barely enough to count as movement, yet it changes how the sounds around you arrange themselves. The wind swells, then thins. Snow trails along the outer wall, somewhere outside, perhaps at the shed. Something taps in a loose irregular rhythm, not threatening, just persistent. The sort of little noise that becomes enormous once darkness closes in. The isolation presses differently at night, in daylight. Even a remote place can feel merely spacious. You can see the fields, the line of trees, the path to the barn, the practical geography of life. At night in a storm, all of that disappears. The homestead shrinks into what the lamp can reach. The rest of the prairie becomes an idea, vast and invisible. You know it is there, but knowledge is thinner than sight. This is when people in lonely houses often became listeners. They listened for the animal, for the fire, for changes in the wind, for the special wrongness of a new sound. It was not superstition exactly. It was vigilance, sharpened by circumstance until it began to resemble instinct. A blizzard was not just scenery, it was information. Every knock, whistle, and shudder might matter. You rise and cross to the back corner where a draught snakes along the floor. Yes, there it is. Cold air, thin but steady, brushing your ankle through the sock. You crouch and feel along the baseboard until your fingers find the gap, a narrow seam between boards. You fetch a rag and press it in firmly. The draught weakens at once. Small victory. Frontier comfort often depends on triumphs too humble for poetry. Snow continues building outside. You can hear it now on the roof in intermittent soft impacts, as if handfuls are being flung upward by the wind. Roofs on prairie houses had a complicated relationship with winter. Too shallow and snow burdened them heavily. Too steep and every gust rearranged the drifts. Builders adapted according to region, materials, and local wisdom, though exact practices varied enormously. Historians generally agree that a well-built roof was a matter of survival rather than style. Scholars still disagree on how much settlers borrowed architectural forms from Eastern traditions that did not always suit the plains. Tradition travels eagerly. Weather corrects it. You check the kettle. The water is just under a simmer, sending out thin threads of steam. You pour a little into a cup and hold it in both hands, not because you need a drink, but because the warmth feels grounding. The cup is thick, the glaze slightly rough at one chip along the rim. Steam rises and dampens your face. For a moment the storm sounds farther away, blurred by heat and porcelain. Then the wind changes again. It comes from another angle, sharper, and the whole house registers it. The wall gives a low, long creak. The stovepipe hum deepens. The curtain bellies inward just slightly where cold air presses at the window frame. You set the cup down and stand still. This is not panic, 'tis attention. The body goes quiet on its own, making room for listening. Nothing follows at first except another hard sweep of snow and a rattle against the porch, probably drifting against the step. Probably. Frontier nights were full of probabilities. A loose board, a chain, a branch, a latch, an animal. The mind offered possibilities faster than the eyes could confirm them. That is one reason storms felt so large. They made imagination work over time. A quirky but well-documented habit among settlers was the use of guide ropes during severe winter weather, stretched from house to barn so no one could lose the route in whiteout conditions. The image sounds dramatic, and it was. In some regions it was also entirely sensible. On bad nights people could become disoriented only yards from shelter. Not every homestead had such a rope, but enough accounts mentioned them to show how seriously blizzards were taken. The prairie had no patience for people who confused familiarity with safety. The stove door clicks softly as the log settles. You open it, poke the coals, and feel a wash of intense heat on your face. It smells almost sweet for a second, that deep-baked smell of burning wood and iron. The flames brighten, then lower, then settle into a strong, steady burn. Good. Fire is one thing you can answer directly. Wind will do as it likes. The stove, at least, negotiates. From the cupboard you take a small tin of matches and set it nearer the lamp. Then you move the lantern closer to hand as well. These tiny preparations alter the mood. You're not bracing in fear. You're arranging the room for uncertainty. There is a difference. One is surrender. The other is homestead life. The air feels drier as the fire strengthens, and you notice how the skin over your knuckles tightens from heat after so much cold. Your cheeks are warm, yet the tip of your nose still holds a faint memory of outside. Such mixed sensations belong to winter houses. Warmth here is never complete enough to let you forget what season it is. Again you think of the animals, not because you hear distress, but because a storm naturally expands the mind toward all vulnerable things. You imagine the horse turned in its stall, the cow settled into hay-scented dimness, the hens fluffed into rounded sleep. Barns had their own winter music, muffled and living. Out here, walls mattered immensely. A plank between flesh and wind could mean everything. You return to the chair but do not rock this time. You simply sit. The lamp flame holds steady. The room seems smaller now, and more precious for that. Table, shelf, stove, curtained window, braided rug. This is the entire visible world for the moment. Beyond it lies the storm, still sweeping over the prairie with a vast cold indifference that would be almost grand if it were not so determined to prove a point. There is no dramatic collapse, no shattered pane, no wolves howling conveniently at the edge of the yard like hired musicians. Real frontier weather had less theatrical timing and more relentless repetition. It pressed, it scraped, it built drifts against doors and iced over tracks and tested every careless weakness in wall, roof, hinge, and habit. That was enough. It did not need embellishment. You lean your head slightly and listen to the layers of sound. The closest is the stove, ticking now and then as iron expands. Behind that, the faint breath of the lamp. Behind that, wind rubbing along the walls in long strokes. Then the sharper noise of snow striking the north side. Then, farther off, the strange open roar of the storm moving over the plains beyond the house, like surf heard in a dream. That last sound is the loneliest. It reminds you how small the homestead is compared with the world around it. And yet the house holds. That fact becomes more impressive with each passing minute. The walls remain upright. The flame burns. The kettle steams. Your chair stands on its 4 honest legs. Human skill, humble and unglamorous, is proving itself against a weather system of outrageous scale. There is comfort in that, but also respect. A homestead is not a fortress. It is a practical argument. Tonight, for now, it is winning. The storm continues to close around the little building until the sense of being alone is almost complete. The window is curtained. The yard is gone from sight. The world has narrowed to lamplight, warm iron, and the disciplined quiet of a room prepared for whatever the night still intends to say. The worst of the outdoor tasks are finished. Supper has settled warmly in your stomach, and the storm has made its position clear. This is the hour when a prairie household turns inward. Not idle, exactly. There is always something to mend, fold, trim, sort, or save. But the pace changes. The body no longer strains against weather and weight. It begins to work in quieter ways, with fingers instead of shoulders, with patience instead of speed. The homestead grows intimate under the lamp. You draw the basket of mending closer to the stove and set it beside the rocking chair. Inside are the ordinary casualties of life on the frontier. A mitten with a thinning thumb, a shirt cuff worn nearly transparent at the edge, a child's stocking with a neat hole at the heel, a loose button wrapped in a scrap of cloth for safekeeping, a needle book, thread, darning wool, scissors with black handles polished by years of use. The basket smells faintly of soap, wool, and cedar. It is the smell of small domestic emergencies waiting their turn. You pick up the mitten first. The wool is soft in places, rough in others, and still carries a trace of outdoor air despite its hours by the stove. You turn it in the light, feel the weakness in the yarn, and thread a needle. The motion is so practiced it seems almost thoughtless, though it is really the opposite. This kind of work is concentrated in a quiet way. Eyes narrow, fingers learn the route. A weakened place is not hidden. It is strengthened. Mending occupied a great deal of frontier life, especially in winter when field labour eased a little and lamplight hours lengthened. Historians broadly agree that rural households repaired clothing relentlessly because fabric was expensive, travel to stores could be difficult, and replacement was never casual. Yet scholars still argue over how much of this labour fell exclusively to women in daily practice, because memoirs, letters, and account books often blur shared work inside the household. Necessity has a habit of redistributing ideals. The thread passes in and out with tiny firm movements, stitch by stitch. The vulnerable place becomes denser. You can hear the needle tap lightly against your thimble. The chair creaks once as you lean closer. Outside, the storm rubs along the walls in long cold strokes, but here at the edge of the stove warmth gathers around your knees and hands. It is one of the more peculiar comforts of winter, this coexistence of harsh weather and domestic concentration. The room feels almost protected by attention. On the table rests a small pile of clothes waiting their turn. A hem has come loose. A patch must be added to work trousers polished thin at the knees. A shawl fringe has tangled itself into a patient annoyance. These are not glamorous problems, but frontier life runs on them. A mended garment buys another month, sometimes another season, and that means less fabric spent, less money needed, fewer worries invited indoors. Economy here is not stinginess, it is architecture. It keeps the whole life standing. You hold the stocking over a wooden darning egg and begin another repair. The worn hole opens under the light like a tiny window into inconvenience. The yarn moves across it, first in one direction, then the other, woven into a new surface. Darning is oddly soothing to watch, almost like building a bridge in miniature. One practical thread meets another until weakness becomes pattern. Your fingers grow warm from the work. The wool slides softly against your skin. There is a reason winter evenings encouraged handiwork beyond simple repair. Quilting, knitting, spinning, net making, candle dipping, soap preparation, tool maintenance, and many other tasks filled the indoor season whenever supplies and energy allowed. Historians know these evenings could be intensely productive, but they also recognise that memory sometimes turns them into sentimental tableau, all sweetness and lamplight. The truth was gentler and rougher at once. People worked because work remained. They also found pleasure in competence, which is a different thing from romance and often better. A knitting basket near the chair holds unfinished socks in thick grey yarn. You lift them and feel their weight, heavier than modern factory knitwear, made for friction, cold, and long days in boots. Knitting on the frontier was not a quaint pastime performed for artistic effect. It was infrastructure. Warm socks mattered. Mittens mattered. Caps mattered. Cold feet can spoil the mind faster than philosophy can repair it. You set the knitting aside for a moment and glance toward the cupboard where the family Bible, an almanac, and a few schoolbooks stand in their narrow order. Reading often shared the evening with sewing. One person mended while another read aloud, or else stories rose from memory and repetition rather than from pages. Oral life remained strong in isolated places, especially where books were few and darkness came early. The house might be lonely in one sense, but it was rarely silent when people had both fatigue and imagination. Those conditions tend to produce talk, so a story begins. Perhaps it comes from the chair nearest the stove, in a voice worn smooth by use, not loud, not theatrical, just steady. A tale about a neighbour who once drove a wagon 30 miles in bad weather for flour and returned with the flour. No patience, and only 3 spokes left intact. Or a story of a travelling peddler whose samples froze so hard one winter that his comb snapped like biscuits when dropped. Frontier humour had a practical grain to it. People laughed at inconvenience because there was such a limitless supply. One quirky detail from Prairie Recollections is how often weather itself became the punchline. A cold snap would be described as fierce enough to freeze soup in the spoon or stop words halfway out of a man's mouth. These claims were exaggerated, obviously, though not always by as much as one might hope. Hyperbole flourished where hardship was common. It gave shape to suffering, and it made the teller sound resilient rather than merely miserable. A useful trick. Really, you smile into your sewing as the story continues, each sentence paced to the fire's quiet crackle. The room glows around the speaker and the listener alike. Lamplight rests on hands, thread, the edge of a teacup, the polished curve of a chair arm. The atmosphere thickens with warmth and repetition. Outside, the storm continues its broad, impersonal labour over the prairie. Inside, human life replies with jokes, yarn, and patched thumbs. Then perhaps the talk turns more thoughtful. That often happened at night. Daytime had no room for speculation beyond what the next task required. But evening invited reflection. People might speak of crops, or the price of nails in town, or whether spring would come early, or whether a distant cousin would ever answer a letter sent months ago. They might wonder aloud if the new family west of the creek had enough hay. They might say little for a while, and let the stove talk instead. Historians still debate the emotional tone of frontier domestic life, because the evidence is uneven. Some letters describe crushing isolation, monotony, and longing for older homes. Others emphasize pride, religious faith, family closeness, or even pleasure in independence. Both sets of accounts are credible. Mood changed with season, health, harvest, money, marriage, luck, and plain temperament. A stormy evening like this could feel oppressive to one person and deeply comforting to another. Often it was both within the same hour. You pick up the trousers and study the knees. The fabric there has gone shiny from repeated wear. The thread strained but not entirely defeated. You cut a patch from older cloth, sturdy and close in colour if not exact. Matching was a luxury. Strength mattered more. The patch is pinned into place and stitched down with neat firm bites. Work trousers, after all, are not invited to balls. They're invited to survive. Your fingers begin to slow as the warmth and rhythm of the room settle deeper into you. Needlework under lamplight asks a great deal from the eyes, and you can feel the slight blur that comes from sustained focus. You pause, lean back, and rest your hands in your lap. The skin across your knuckles looks dry from soap and cold. There is a faint prick where the needle caught you earlier. Such little injuries belong to domestic work the way splinters belong to chopping wood. By the stove, someone turns an apple slowly in hand before setting it to bake near the heat. The skin wrinkles. A sweet fragrance gradually unfolds into the room, gentle and familiar. It mingles with smoke, wool, and warm iron. That simple scent can soften an evening at once. Baked apples, toast at the stove, popcorn in a pan, a pinch of cinnamon if fortune was smiling. These small treats did not belong to luxury exactly. They belonged to morale. Children, if present in such a household, might spend this hour with slates, copybooks, or quiet games. Lessons on isolated farms were often irregular, interrupted by planting, harvesting, illness, weather, and the practical fact that cows do not respect arithmetic schedules. Yet many families pushed education wherever they could fit it. Letters and numbers represented mobility, ambition, and a certain stubborn trust in the future. Even a primer by lamplight in a storm carried hope inside it. You imagine small hands tracing letters with blunt concentration, while an older hand knits nearby. This soundscape would be delicate. Chalk on slate, page turn, needle through cloth, fire settling in the stove, wind stroking the outer wall, nothing grand. Yet a whole civilization can be heard in such a room if you listen correctly. A bit later, the mending basket yields a shirt missing 2 buttons. You choose replacements from a little tin, each one slightly different because uniform sets rarely survive long in honest households. One pale bone button, one darker one. It will do. Many frontier garments became patchworks of necessity, their repairs recording trade routes, salvage habits, and the limits of what the nearest store stocked 6 months ago. Scholars still dispute how much self-conscious pride families took in neat repairs versus merely accepting visible mending as unavoidable. Probably that depended on who might be seeing the shirt. Vanity survives surprisingly well in hard conditions. The conversation shifts again, perhaps toward old superstitions and weather signs. Someone says the storm will break by morning if the wind swings west. Someone else doubts it. Someone remembers hearing that candles burn blue before severe cold. Another claims aches in the knee predict snow more accurately than any almanac. Scientific certainty is in short supply out here, but observation is not. A remote household gathers evidence the way it gathers firewood, from repeated encounters with the same unruly world. Such talk is not foolish. It is a form of belonging. To name signs is to insist that the land is legible, even if only partly. Prairie settlers often borrowed weather lore from indigenous knowledge, immigrant traditions, local experiment, and stubborn guesswork all at once. Historians know these streams mixed freely, though tracing exact origins is difficult. Knowledge on the frontier did not always arrive with labels attached. The baked apple is ready. Its skin has split. Steam escapes when it is opened with a spoon. The flesh inside is soft, almost floral in sweetness, and hot enough to make you careful. A little molasses on top turns it richer. The treat is small, but deeply satisfying. Warm fruit on a storm night feels like a private luxury that has somehow slipped past winter's gatekeeper. At last the mending basket begins to empty. Repaired items are folded and stacked. The mitten has a stronger thumb. The stocking heel is whole again. The shirt buttons hold. The trousers can face another week of work without complaint, or with less of it. These are tiny victories, but they accumulate. Life in a lonely homestead is built from them, one patched place at a time. You set the needle safely into its cloth page and close the basket. The room has grown softer as the evening deepens. Lamplight seems thicker now, more golden. The rocking chair stands quiet. The stove carries the calm authority of a thing doing its job well. Outside, the storm continues to move over the endless prairie, unconcerned and untired. Inside, hands have kept busy. Stories have passed the dark from one hour to the next, and the house feels sturdier for it. Not in timber, perhaps, but in spirit. You sit very still for a moment and listen to the little home around you. Its comforts are modest, its people stubborn, its routines repetitive in the best possible way. That is how winter is endured here, not by heroics every minute, by socks mended before they fail, by stories told before silence grows too large, by a baked apple, a warm chair, and the simple refusal to let the night become empty. The evening has thinned into true night now, the sort that makes time feel less like a sequence and more like a pool you drift through slowly. The lamp still burns. The stove still radiates its steady dry heat. The patched clothes are folded away. The cups stand clean, and the little room has done everything it can to appear orderly and calm. Yet the storm outside has not tired. If anything, it has become more confident. The house remains secure, but the darkness has a way of enlarging every sound until even harmless noises arrive with an air of importance. You hear the first odd creak from above while standing near the stove. It is a long, slow complaint from a beam in the ceiling, followed by a soft, settling sound in the rafters. Nothing unusual. Timber shifts when temperature changes, and winter nights are full of such adjustments. Still, your head lifts at once. The body reacts before the mind begins its sensible explanations. That is one of the little tricks of night in a lonely place. It asks your nerves to vote first. The room grows quiet again, though not truly silent. The kettle gives a faint metallic tick. The lamp hums with its small unseen heat. Wind strokes along the outer wall in a slow abrasive whisper, then pauses, then returns with greater force. Somewhere near the porch there comes a brief tapping, as if something light is knocking against wood, a branch perhaps, a loose length of chain, a bit of driven ice. Perfectly ordinary things become suspicious companions after dark. You move to the window and part the curtain just enough to look out. The glass is rimmed with thick frost, and the tiny clear space you make reveals almost nothing. Snow rushes past in pale diagonal streaks. The yard is gone. The fence has disappeared completely. The barn is only a suggestion, a deeper shadow in a world of moving white gloom. You let the curtain fall back into place. The outdoor night has no details to offer, only motion. Sounds behave strangely in winter storms, and settlers notice this constantly. Historians broadly agree that blizzard conditions could distort hearing in ways that made distance hard to judge and direction harder still. Snow absorbed some noises while wind carried others in sudden eerie clarity. Yet scholars still argue over how much later frontier writing exaggerated these effects for drama, because memory is not a neutral archivist. Even so, anyone who has listened to a storm around a small house knows that ordinary acoustics can become wonderfully deceptive without needing any help from imagination. You set another stick of wood into the stove, not because the fire demands it yet, but because doing something with your hands feels sensible. The iron door opens with a low scrape. A wave of heat brushes your face. Flame licks eagerly at the new wood, and for a moment the room seems friendlier again. All orange flicker and warm iron smell. The simple act of tending a fire has a grounding effect. It reminds you that some parts of the night remain obedient. Then the knock comes again, not loud, just 3 uneven taps from somewhere outside the house. You stand still and listen. Nothing follows at first. The wind builds, snow rasps against the wall, then the same light knocking returns, a little faster this time, then stops. The mind begins its efficient parade of possibilities, a shutter edge, a hanging latch, a drifting object striking the porch rail. The homestead at night encourages practicality, but it also leaves a little room for folklore to shuffle in wearing boots made of nonsense. Frontier households carried plenty of stories that became more persuasive after dark. Not grand haunted castle tales, usually. More local things. Strange lights on the prairie, voices heard in wind, riders glimpsed at impossible distances, dogs growling at empty corners. Some of these stories came from loneliness, some from weather, some from real danger only half understood. A few probably came from the universal human delight in making younger listeners feel deliciously uneasy before bed. Civilization may advance, but nobody fully outgrows that instinct. You cross the room slowly and check the door latch again. Secure. The wood of the bar is cool beneath your hand. No movement there. You stand close enough to hear the wind pressing at the boards. It has a low pulsing quality now, as if the whole storm were breathing through its teeth. The door itself remains solid, but the sound on the far side is intimate in an unpleasant way. Weather has no respect for personal boundaries. From the corner near the cupboard comes a sudden small clatter. You turn at once, only to see a tin lid wobbling on the shelf before settling flat. The vibration from a stronger gust must have nudged it loose. Your heart, having briefly committed to melodrama, now resumes its regular duties with mild embarrassment. It is an old truth that many nocturnal mysteries are either architecture or cookware. Still, the atmosphere has changed. The house no longer feels merely warm. It feels watchful. Every creak invites interpretation. The rocking chair, empty now, casts a curved shadow on the floorboards that shifts when the lamp flame wavers. The curtain stirs at the edge where a draught slips through. The stovepipe emits a low note that rises and falls with the wind outside. Each sound is explainable. Taken together, they produce a mood that is harder to dismiss. One odd frontier tidbit turns up in memoirs and local lore often enough to be delightful. Some people believed that listening carefully to a stove on a winter night could tell you tomorrow's weather. If the iron popped sharply, more cold was coming. If it settled heavily, snow might ease. This is not recognised modern science, which will surely shock the stove, but it reveals the same instinct behind so much homestead life. People read signs everywhere because the environment demanded attention and rewarded pattern making. Even when the patterns were arguable, you sit again, this time without rocking, and let your hearing stretch outward. The nearest layer of sound is the dry crackle of fire consuming wood grain. Beyond that, the lamp's faint whisper. Then the boards, occasionally answering pressure with a small click or sigh. Outside lies the broad-moving roar of wind over open land, and within that roar, smaller details surface and vanish. A scrape, a tap, something that sounds almost like a footstep, then resolves into snow slipping from the roof edge. Night enjoys producing imitations. The smells of the room are stronger when you sit still. Warm dust on iron, old pine from the floorboards, a lingering sweetness from the baked apple, wool drying by the stove, lamp oil, faint but persistent. These familiar scents help steady the mind because they belong to known things, named things, useful things. The storm outside may be vast, but indoors every smell has a source. That matters more than it sounds. Then there is the barn, not visible now, but present in thought and in occasional sound. If you listen very carefully between gusts, you can almost convince yourself you hear a horse shift its weight, or a cow knock softly against wood. Perhaps you do hear it. Perhaps the mind simply supplies the noise because it wants proof that ordinary life continues out there in the dark. Frontier nights often depended on such reassurance. Animals moving normally meant shelter was holding. Routines were intact, and the world had not gone entirely strange. Some settlers became extraordinarily sensitive to animal noises in bad weather. A horse kicking too often, cattle bawling in an unusual way, chickens breaking into agitation at the wrong hour. Any of these could suggest trouble. Historians know livestock care required constant listening as much as watching, especially when storms made outdoor checks difficult. Yet there is still scholarly debate over how often families truly went out repeatedly in severe conditions versus trusting experience and conserving strength. The ideal response in memoirs is often brave. The probable response in reality was sometimes, quite sensibly, to stay by the stove and hope the latch on the barn had the decency to keep doing its job. A new sound arrives from the chimney, a hollow moaning tone that swells unexpectedly and then cuts off at once. You feel it more than hear it at first, a change in pressure that seems to touch the room itself. The lamp flame dips, the curtain trembles. You glance up, shoulders tightening without your permission. Then the draught corrects, and the stove resumes its steadier breathing. Wind has shifted around the roofline, nothing more. But for a second the whole house seemed to pause and listen with you. There are reasons why so many frontier evenings produce stories of omens and second sight. Isolation sharpens the senses, but it also leaves them underemployed. Once chores are finished and darkness seals the windows, the mind begins composing with whatever material is available. A scrape becomes a signal, a knock becomes a visitor, a silence becomes a question. It is not foolishness exactly. It is imagination pressed into service by loneliness, and perhaps by a very old human suspicion that the dark contains intentions. You lean over and trim the lamp wick again. The flame grows a little smaller, more golden, less smoky. Shadows soften at once. That helps. Bright light can make the darkness beyond it seem harsher, while a lower flame turns the room gentler and less exposed. This is bedtime mathematics of a very old kind. How much light is enough to comfort, and how much only advertises your existence to the giant storm outside. The knocking sound returns for a third time, and now you catch its rhythm more clearly. Not random after all. It comes when the wind gusts from a certain angle. There is the shove against the wall, the rattle of snow along the sill, then tap-tap against the porch side. Once you hear the pattern, the mystery shrinks at once. Something near the step has worked itself loose, and is striking the boards only under that specific pressure. The mind relaxes reluctantly, disappointed perhaps that the world remains physical when it had half prepared itself for fable. Even so, the night keeps offering little tests. Floorboards contract and answer with tiny cracks like distant twigs breaking. A spoon in the drying cloth shifts and falls over with a sound absurdly large in the room. The settling loaf on the shelf gives a small sigh as its crust cools. From the wall comes the faintest rustle that might be a mouse behind the boards, industriously pursuing its own domestic ambitions. Frontier homes were not sealed kingdoms. They housed human beings, weather, and occasionally other tenants with whiskers. You smile at that thought despite yourself. A mouse can be wonderfully grounding. Hard to feel haunted when the most likely culprit is 4 inches long and interested in oats. The hour grows later. The storm remains loud but has become more legible, divided now into recognizable parts. The long sweep over the roof, the hiss of drifted snow along the north wall, the chimney's intermittent mournful note, the porch tapping when wind angles right, the barn noises imagined or real, but comforting either way. The house is still surrounded by darkness, yes, but not by mystery alone. Listening has turned fear into inventory. That may be one of the quiet skills frontier life taught best. You learn the difference between threatening sounds and merely lonely ones. Not every eerie noise deserves alarm. Many just require naming. Once named, they join the household. The beam creaks, the shutter taps, the mice rustle, the chimney moans, the wind presses, the fire answers. By midnight, the room has become a map made entirely of sound. You rise at last and stand by the stove, palms open toward its heat. The iron gives back a firm welcome. Behind you, the little house continues its murmur of boards and fabric and tin. Beyond that, the blizzard moves over the invisible prairie with tireless cold authority. Yet here in this small island of light, your breathing slows. The sounds are still there. They have not grown gentler, but they are known now, and in a lonely winter homestead, known sounds are their own kind of company. At some point the evening stops pretending to be evening and becomes night in full. The lamp burns lower. The stove settles into a deeper rhythm. Your body, warmed by supper and lulled by the weather's endless repetition, begins to feel the honest downward pull of fatigue. This is the hour when a frontier household turns toward bed, though bed in winter is never a simple surrender. Sleep must be prepared for carefully, almost negotiated, because the cold waits in the unheated parts of the house with excellent patience. You begin with the fire, before any blanket is folded back or any boot set aside. The stove must be judged for the night. Too little wood and the room will cool into misery before dawn. Too much and the fire may burn wastefully, or make the air too dry. Too close, too uneasy for rest. You crouch and study the coals through the iron grate. They glow a deep pulsing red under a crust of ash, like hidden embers in a black cave. When you stir them gently, orange light blooms upward and briefly gilds your hands. A thicker log goes in now, one chosen for slow steady burning rather than quick showy flame. The wood catches gradually, first with a small tongue of light at the bark, then with a firmer crackle as the split face begins to take. The scent rises warm and resinous. You lower the draught with practiced care. Night fire is different from evening fire. It is built not for companionship, but endurance. Keeping warm after dark was one of the great domestic arts of frontier life. Historians broadly agree that many prairie bedrooms remained only faintly heated, if at all, because fuel was too valuable to squander and house. Layouts did not always carry stove heat well. Yet scholars still dispute how much comfort varied by class, region, and decade, since some households managed better insulation or extra stoves while others slept in conditions that sound very nearly punitive. Winter did not distribute fairness evenly. It rarely bothered trying. The sleeping room, or sleeping corner if the house is small enough, feels noticeably cooler as you move away from the stove. Your cheeks sense it first, then your hands. The air here has that still cold quality of fabric, wood, and walls that have held darkness quietly for hours. The bed stands waiting beneath layered quilts, looking inviting in principle and suspicious in practice. Beds in winter often do that. Beautiful from across the room, treacherous when first entered. You pull back the coverlet and inspect the arrangement beneath. A homespun sheet, a wool blanket, another quilted layer, perhaps a fur throw, if the household owns one, perhaps heated bricks wrapped in cloth, or a warming pan if someone has bothered with the effort. The mattress itself is slightly uneven, filled with straw, corn husks, feathers, wool, or whatever the family has managed to acquire and maintain. It rustles faintly when pressed. No frontier bed is entirely silent. Quilts were among the great practical glories of 19th century domestic life. They provided warmth, decoration, thrift, and at times a record of household history stitched into scraps. Some were pieced from saved fabric remnants, others from more deliberate plans, and many were treasured beyond their plain monetary worth. Historians know quilting could be communal in some regions and seasons, while in other cases it remained simply one more useful skill done at home. Scholars still argue over how much artistic intention should be emphasized in interpreting old quilts. The quilts themselves, one suspects, would prefer to be praised for warmth first and symbolism afterward. You shake out a blanket and the cold trapped in its folds brushes your wrists. The wool smells faintly of cedar and stored cloth, with a little smoke in it from the room. You smooth it over the mattress and tuck one corner down. The motions are slow now, softer than those of the day. Fatigue has entered the muscles. Even your thoughts seem wrapped in wool, moving steadily but without urgency. Night clothing is simpler and heavier than modern comfort expects. Stockings may stay on. A flannel shift or long shirt is pulled on, cool at first against the skin, then gradually less shocking. Some people slept in caps to preserve warmth. Some wrapped scarves at the throat. Some wore enough layers to look prepared for maritime disaster. The frontier was not sentimental about sleepwear. Its purpose was not elegance. It was to keep you from waking convinced your own ears had frozen off. One old detail from winter household accounts is the widespread habit of warming stones or bricks near the stove and slipping them between blankets before bed. It was a sensible little miracle, provided the brick was hot enough to comfort, but not so hot that it scorched cloth or toes. People also used warming pans filled with embers, sweeping them carefully between the sheets. The result must have felt marvellous, also slightly alarming. Nothing says restful domestic routine like introducing live heat to your bedding, and hoping character will manage the rest. You carry a warmed brick now, wrapped in worn flannel, and lay it near the foot of the bed. Its heat presses through the cloth in a solid, pleasant way. That one object changes the whole prospect of sleep. The bed no longer looks merely layered, it looks survivable. Your boots are pulled off and setups are down near, but not too near, the stove side of the room. Wet leather must dry, but not crack. Their weight thumps softly on the floorboards. Socks remain for the moment while you stand on the braided rug, grateful not to meet the bare boards directly. The rug feels rough and slightly springy underfoot. Even that small barrier against the cold earns appreciation at this hour. Then there are the little bedtime rituals that seem trivial until you imagine neglecting them. Water is checked and covered so it does not gather ash or insects. However few insects winter is kind enough to leave alive. Matches are placed within reach. The lamp reservoir is judged. The poker is leaned where a sleepy hand can find it. A shawl rests on the chair. Tomorrow's clothes are set out in practical order, because dawn is not the time to discover a missing mitten. Order at night is mercy in the morning. You wash your face and hands in water warmed only slightly from the stove. The basin is cool at the rim. The cloth smells of soap and clean cotton. Water touches your skin with a brisk honesty that wakes you just enough to notice how tired you actually are. The day's dust lifts. The cold tightness at your temples eases. You dry off quickly, because lingering over ablutions in a winter room is a luxury for people with central heating and poor perspective. The lamp is turned lower. At once the room changes. Its edges soften. The whitewashed boards take on a honeyed dimness. Shadows gather gently under the table and around the chair legs. The stove glow becomes more important, a dull red presence behind iron and seam. Light no longer reaches every useful object, only the nearest ones: bed, basin, chair, boots, folded clothes. Beyond them, the room recedes into darkness that feels domestic rather than empty. This softer lighting mattered in ways harder to describe than to feel. A dim room invites the body to quiet itself. The world narrows to what can be reached without standing. The mind releases its grip on larger distances. Outside, the storm still moves over the prairie in huge indifferent sweeps. Inside, the light has decided that only this small circle deserves attention. You sit on the bed edge and test the mattress. It gives unevenly under your weight, then steadies. The warmed brick at the foot radiates through the covers. One hand slides beneath the top quilt to judge the temperature. Better than expected. Not luxurious, but kind enough to trust. You can hear the stove ticking in the other room, if the bed is set apart, or just a few feet away. If the house is small enough that privacy is mostly theoretical. Many frontier homes had very little separation between living and sleeping space. Curtains, furniture, and courtesy often did the work, walls could not. Historians generally agree that privacy on isolated homesteads was limited, especially in early years or in smaller dwellings. Families slept close, spoke quietly, and developed a practical tolerance for shared space that would puzzle many modern people. Yet scholars still disagree on how residents themselves felt about that closeness, because surviving accounts range from matter-of-fact acceptance to real longing for personal room. Human beings are wonderfully consistent in wanting both companionship and distance, ideally at the same time. You slide under the covers. The first touch is cold. There is no point pretending otherwise. The sheet startles the legs, the pillow is cool on one side and the blanket settles with a heavy chill, before your own warmth begins to argue with it. You draw the quilt higher. Another blanket comes up to the chin. The bed smells of clean cloth, cedar, faint smoke, and the dry, dusty scent of stored wool. Your toes reach cautiously toward the warmed brick and sigh inwardly when they find it. That first minute under winter covers has its own peculiar drama. The body curls instinctively, conserving heat. Shoulders tuck, knees rise slightly, hands disappear under the blanket edge or between the thighs for warmth. Every person becomes a small determined animal at bedtime in cold weather. No matter how philosophical they may have been over supper, the pillow is lumpy in a familiar way, perhaps feather-filled and inclined to migrate, perhaps stuffed with softer, humble materials that bunch and settle unpredictably. You punch it once, then again, until it gives in. The quilt's weight presses pleasantly over your chest. That heaviness is deeply comforting, like being told by cloth that it intends to keep watch. There is a distinct frontier smell to bedrooms in winter. It is not perfume and not stale exactly. It is linen, wool, cedar chests, skin dried by cold air, lamp soot, and the faint mineral scent of frost at the window. It is an honest smell, lived in and useful. Many old houses carried it. Very few people wrote poetry about it. Another oversight by history. Outside, the blizzard goes on. You hear it now in a more muffled form, dulled by bedding and the pillow's hold around one ear. Wind hums along the boards. Snow ticks against the pane. Somewhere the chimney issues a low wandering note. Yet from bed those sounds lose some of their sharpness. They become part of the larger texture of the night, less like warnings now and more like proof that the house remains between you and the weather. There is one more task before true sleep can begin. You lean out from the blankets and reach for the lamp. The glass chimney is warm near the top. The metal wheel under your fingers turns with a tiny resistance as you lower the flame to its smallest useful point or extinguish it altogether, depending on habit and caution. The room dims further, then almost disappears. Darkness inside a winter homestead is never complete. The stove still gives a reddish pulse when the coals shift. A little moonlight pallor may press faintly through the frost at the window, though the storm hides most of it. Shapes remain where memory says they should be: chair, door, table, basin. The room is now known by outline rather than sight. You settle down fully at last. The blankets, which seemed cold and unfriendly a moment ago, begin to change their mind. Heat gathers around your knees, your feet, your shoulders. The brick at the bed's foot steadies the warmth. Your breathing deepens under the covers, each exhale briefly warming the small sheltered air near your face before drifting away. The hard work of the day shows itself now in heaviness through the limbs. Calves ache faintly. Hands throb with old cold and finished chores. Back muscles loosen by degrees. A final curious tidbit survives in some frontier recollections. People sometimes judged the severity of the night by what froze indoors before morning. Water in the wash basin, a damp towel left too near the wall, even boots if left carelessly placed. It sounds grim because it was grim, though often treated with a shrug in the records. Human beings can normalize astonishing things once repetition has had a few seasons to work on them. Your eyes close and then open once more to the dark. The room feels both exposed and protected, a fragile pocket of warmth held together by blankets, brick, fire, and habit. This is how rest begins on the prairie in winter, not in softness without effort, but in layers, in redness, in the slow, earned comfort of a bed that must be warmed by patience first, then by sleep. Sleep on the frontier is rarely one long smooth descent. It comes in stretches, in bargains, in pauses shaped by weather and fire. At first you drift well enough under the piled quilts, warmed at the feet by the wrapped brick, and held down by the pleasant weight of blankets that have finally accepted their duties. The storm continues outside, but from within bed it becomes distant, almost rhythmic. Wind along the walls, a low note in the chimney, the faint ticking of cooling metal. These sounds fold into your dreams until you're no longer sure whether you're hearing them or merely remembering that you should. Then you wake, not all at once, more like rising slowly through dark water. Your eyes remain closed at first. The body notices before the mind does. The room is cooler. One shoulder has slipped near the edge of the blanket and found a pocket of air sharp enough to sting. Your nose is cold. The warmth at your feet has weakened. Somewhere beyond the bed, a new sound is present, small but insistent. The stove has changed its voice. You open your eyes into near darkness. For a moment there is nothing to see, only the impression of familiar shapes held in blackness. The window is a faint pale square through frost. The chair stands as a darker angle near the wall. The stove, farther off, gives only a low dull red at its seams where the coals still live beneath ash. The house feels larger in the middle of the night, even though nothing has moved. Darkness stretches the distance between bed and fire into something surprisingly significant. You lie still and listen. The wind has not gone. It rarely grants such favours. But it sounds different now, lower and less frantic, as though the storm has settled into endurance rather than attack. Snow still brushes the walls in dry occasional sweeps. The chimney hum rises and falls softly. From somewhere in the room a board gives a tiny click. The stove answers with a faint metallic tick of its own. That is the sound that woke you. Not danger, exactly. Just the quiet announcement that the fire has burned down and the house is slipping toward deeper cold. Night waking for the fire was a familiar routine in many winter households. Historians broadly agree that in severe weather, people often rose at least once to tend embers, especially in smaller dwellings where a dying stove quickly changed the comfort of the whole room. Yet scholars still argue over how regularly this happened in practice, because not every memoir mentions it and memory is biased toward the unusual. The truth was probably practical and uneven. Some nights the fire held. Some nights you got up because no sensible person wished to wake inside a wooden icebox. You tuck your chin deeper into the blanket for another few seconds, debating with the private laziness of a tired body. The bed is warmer than the room. The room is colder than it has any right to be. The mind offers one weak argument for staying still, then abandons it because the answer is obvious. If the stove is not fed now, the next hour will be worse. Frontier life has many lessons. One of them is that postponing discomfort often means purchasing a larger quantity later. With a small, resigned breath, you throw back the covers and sit up. The cold reaches you at once. It gets under the nightshirt, around the neck, down the sleeves. The floor beneath your stockinged feet feels like compacted winter itself, even through the rug's thin defence. You pull on the shawl left on the chair, or wrap a blanket around your shoulders before standing fully. Every movement in the dark seems louder than it should be. Bed ropes creak. The mattress rustles. The floorboards answer underfoot with careful little groans. You cross to the stove slowly, one hand out at first until memory of the room takes over. The air smells different now. Less of warm wool and more of ash, cooled iron, and the faint mineral chill that enters when firelight withdraws. At the stove you crouch and hold your hands near the door seam. Yes, some heat remains, but not much. The iron is warm, not hot. Opening the stove at midnight is a distinct sensory experience. The latch lifts with a small, dry sound. The door swings out. A dim red cave of coals glows under the ash bed, beautiful and slightly accusing, as if the fire had hoped you would notice sooner. When you stir them with the poker, sparks leap up in a brief golden swarm and the room changes instantly. Light flickers over the floorboards, over the chair, over your wrapped shoulders. Heat brushes your face in one welcome breath. You add kindling first, then a split stick, then a thicker piece once flame takes. The wood catches with tiny sharp snaps. Resin warms. Smoke pulls upward correctly. Thank heaven. Rather than drifting into the room and turning the whole noble enterprise into coughing. In a minute the fire is revived enough to sound alive again, crackling softly, no longer whispering its last. One quirky frontier tidbit appears in old recollections often enough to be charming. Many people claimed they could tell by smell when a stove needed tending before they fully woke. Not smoke exactly, but the thinning scent of heat itself, the room's warmth changing from active to residual. Modern life rarely trains the nose for such tasks, which is a shame. You're probably capable of many ancient talents that central heating has kindly allowed to retire. You remain crouched a moment longer, palms open to the new warmth. It reaches the skin quickly and painfully at first, that familiar prickling return from chill to comfort. Your fingertips sting. Your face feels overbright on one side and cold on the other. Fire in the middle of the night is never abstract. It is immediate. It reminds you that survival sometimes consists of nothing more glamorous than getting out of bed and feeding the stove before the room goes sour. The house seems to wake with you, though only a little. As heat rises again, the iron ticks in steadier rhythm. A beam overhead gives a low, small settling note. The curtain near the window stirs where a draught runs behind it. Somewhere, perhaps in the wall, perhaps under the floor, comes the faint rustle of a mouse pursuing its own midnight duties. Life continues in miniature while the prairie beyond the walls remains enormous and unseen. You glance toward the window. The frost there has thickened into a white crust around the edges. Fern patterns layered over fern patterns, grown by cold in perfect silent industry. A narrow clear patch near the centre shows almost nothing beyond. Only a faint storm glow and the blur of blowing snow. The world outside is reduced to weather without landscape. No fence, no yard, no barn, just motion and pallor. That sight, or near lack of sight, deepens the strange feeling of midnight isolation more than darkness alone ever could. Historians know that winter nights in isolated districts could be psychologically intense, not only because of danger, but because of the scale of solitude. Letters and diaries sometimes mention feeling cut off, watchful, or oddly sharpened in the small hours. Yet scholars still debate how representative those feelings were, since people are more likely to record unusual wakefulness than ordinary sleep. Probably most nights passed without philosophical distress. But on storm nights, in lonely houses, the mind did sometimes expand into the dark, whether invited or not. You straighten slowly, blankets still around your shoulders, and stand by the stove in the half-light. The room is beautiful in this reduced way. No lamp now, only fire glow. The table is bronze at the edges. The wash basin catches a dim crescent on its rim. The chair is almost entirely shadow. Your boots by the wall look like small patient animals waiting for morning. The atmosphere is hushed, intimate, and slightly unreal, as if the night has stepped indoors but agreed to behave itself. At times like this, thoughts grow peculiar. You may think about the distance to the nearest neighbour and find it larger than it seemed at supper. You may imagine the road fully covered and the fields without boundary lines. You may wonder how many people are awake at this very hour across the wider prairie, each in their own small house, each listening to their own stove, each believing themselves alone. The answer is probably more than one, and fewer than you would prefer. A midnight house invites reflection because there is so little else to do while waiting for the fire to strengthen. The body is awake but unwilling. The room is quiet but not empty. Outside remains inaccessible. So the mind turns over practical matters, small hopes, private worries, bits of memory. Did the barn latch hold firmly enough? Will the drift reach the porch by morning? Is there enough flour left in the sack to stretch another week? Did you remember to bring in the extra bucket? Such thoughts are not dramatic. They are simply the natural currency of a life built on preparation. Some frontier recollections mention listening for wolves during winter nights. Though the actual danger varied greatly by region and era, wolves certainly existed across many prairie landscapes, and their sounds could carry far in cold weather. But scholars still argue over how much fear of them was practical, and how much belonged to inherited storytelling and settler myth-making. In any case, the imagination remains perfectly willing to borrow their reputation, even when the only real culprit outside is wind and a loose board conducting itself with theatrical dedication. You take the poker and settle the logs once more. Sparks rise, then vanish. The new flame is healthy now, licking steadily along the wood. Good. That should hold for a while. You place the poker back within reach and consider returning to bed immediately, but linger just long enough to enjoy the fresh pocket of warmth growing around the stove. Midnight fire has a companionship of its own. It asks nothing except fuel and attention, and in return it makes the room habitable. Then something thumps outside. A single muffled sound against the outer wall or near the porch, hard to place in the layered hush of snow and wind. You freeze, head turned slightly. The house becomes absolutely still, or seems to. Another second passes, then another. Nothing. Likely snow sliding from the roof edge or a drift collapsing against the step. The sensible explanation arrives first this time, which is progress of a kind. Night has taught you the house's habits well enough that not every mystery gets to dress itself as a threat. Still, you listen a while longer. The storm's voice remains broad and low, less violent than before but deep with distance. The chimney issues its soft, wandering tone. Snow whispers at the wall. Somewhere the new log cracks sharply, bright as a snapped twig in the dark. These are the sounds of a world narrowed to essentials: fire, wind, wood, breath. It is almost monastic. If monasteries commonly required you to haul your own water and worry about chickens freezing, eventually the cold at your bare wrists persuades you that contemplation has had enough of your time. You return to the bed, lifting the covers and slipping back into the pocket of warmth left by your body. The sheets are cooler now than when you abandoned them, but not cruelly so. The warmed brick still holds a little heat at the foot. You draw the quilt high and turn onto your side, listening as the revived stove begins its firmer quiet crackle across the room. The difference is immediate. The house no longer feels as though it is descending into cold. It feels held again. The mind unclenches, your muscles, briefly awakened by the trip to the stove, soften back into heaviness. Even the storm outside seems farther away now that the fire is answered. You close your eyes. Sleep does not return instantly, but it approaches more gently this time. There is a floating interval in which the room remains partly known. You can still picture the dull red stove seams, the pale window, the outline of the chair, though your eyes are shut. The sounds blur at the edges. Wind becomes one long breath. The fire becomes a pulse. The house becomes a shell of warmth around a very small, sleeping life. And then, with the stove restored and the blizzard still moving over the dark, invisible prairie, you sink once more into the deep winter quiet between midnight and dawn. At first there is only a change in quality. not a true waking. The dark behind your eyes seems less complete. The storm's voice, so broad and constant through the night, has altered into something softer and more distant. You lie still under the quilts, half suspended between sleep and awareness, while the room slowly returns around you in layers. The pillow is warm at one edge, cool at the other. Your hands are tucked beneath the blanket and no longer ache with cold. Somewhere across the room, the stove gives a faint settling tick. Morning is coming, though it arrives here as a thinning of darkness rather than any dramatic burst of light. You open your eyes. The window is a pale square now, grey with dawn behind a heavy crust of frost. The room itself remains dim, but the outlines are gentler than they were in the night. The chair stands beside the wall with honest simplicity. Your boots wait where they were left. Folded clothes rest on the seat. The wash basin catches a weak silver edge. Nothing has moved, yet everything feels different, because the house has survived the storm hours and entered that strange calm which follows weather's long argument with the land. The blankets are warm enough now that leaving them seems unreasonable. Still, curiosity is stronger. There is always a moment after a winter storm when the world must be seen. Not because you expect anything dramatic, but because silence itself becomes news. You sit up slowly, and the room greets you with a coolness that is firm but not cruel. The stove has held better than the darkest hour suggested. The air still carries a little warmth, mixed with ash, wool, and the dry lingering smell of spent fire. You pull on stockings, then clothes chilled by the room. The fabric is brisk against the skin at first, especially at cuffs and collar, but your body's heat begins its patient work at once. You stand, wrap the shawl around your shoulders, and cross to the stove. Inside, beneath a bed of pale ash, a few embers still live. You stir them gently and they answer with hidden orange. Good. A little kindling, a careful breath of air, and the fire begins again. Morning on the frontier often starts with coaxing, not commanding. Rekindling from coals was a small domestic triumph repeated countless times in rural households. Historians broadly agree that preserving fire overnight saved labour, matches, fuel, and sometimes nerves. Yet scholars still debate how consistently people managed it in severe winter weather, since stove quality, wood type, house design, and simple exhaustion could all interfere. Some mornings the coals greeted you like old friends. Some mornings they gave you the dead grey stare of total indifference. Much depended on skill, and a little on luck. The revived stove sends up its first pleasant wash of heat. It touches your hands and face, drawing you more fully into the day. The kettle is set on. Water murmurs faintly as it warms. A pot can follow for porridge, or biscuits, or reheated beans, depending on supplies and energy. Morning food matters after a storm night, even before the first bite. The familiar sounds of breakfast begin stitching the room back into action. But first, the window. You wipe a circle in the frost with the heel of your hand, then widen it until the glass clears enough to look through. The sight beyond it stops you still. The prairie has disappeared beneath whiteness, not merely covered, rewritten. Every fence rail, wagon rut, tuft of grass, and familiar bump in the yard has been altered under a smooth, bright weight of snow. The drift against the porch rises nearly to the lower step. The path to the barn has vanished completely. The shed roof carries a thick curved burden that makes it seem smaller. The sky above is pale and emptied of threat, a clean-washed grey with the faintest suggestion of blue trying to gather behind it. The storm has not left debris so much as silence. Fresh snow changes sound as much as sight. It muffles the world with almost theatrical thoroughness. Historians often note how settlers describe the morning after a storm as unnaturally quiet, and that makes physical sense as well as emotional sense. Snow absorbs and softens, blurring the sharp edges of ordinary life, yet scholars still argue about how much these descriptions reflect real acoustic change versus the relief people felt when wind finally ceased. Probably both. Science and gratitude can coexist quite nicely. You unlatch the door and push. It resists at once. The drift packed against it is dense and heavy. You shove harder with your shoulder until the door opens enough to admit a blade of white daylight and a fist of cold air. That air smells impossibly clean, like ice, distant water, and the barest trace of wood smoke settling low over the yard. Your breath rises in a white cloud. The brightness outside is astonishing after the dim room. Not warm brightness, but a blank reflective brilliance that seems to come from ground and sky at once. Stepping onto the porch requires negotiation. Snow spills inward as the door widens. The drift reaches high around your boots. Powder at the top and denser below where wind has packed it. It squeaks with that distinctive dry, cold sound under pressure. The world is so still you can hear the tiny collapse of loose crystals sliding from the porch rail. Beyond that, almost nothing. You stand there for a moment and look. The cottonwoods in the distance are loaded with snow, every branch edged in white so that the trees resemble ink drawings touched by flour. The fence line can only be guessed by the humps where posts lie buried. The barn door is outlined in frost and drift. The well house is half banked by snow on its windward side. Above everything hangs a morning hush, so complete it feels like a physical presence, as if the prairie itself has lowered its voice in respect for what the night accomplished. This is the hour when practical thought returns quickly. Beautiful, yes. But beauty on a homestead is immediately followed by work boots and a shovel. You cannot admire a drift without also estimating how long it will take to clear. You cannot praise the fresh snow without wondering whether the animals have enough water and whether the door to the barn opens outward or inward. A frontier morning never lets awe go unaccompanied. You pull the coat tighter and begin by digging the porch clear enough that the door can shut properly behind you. The shovel bites with a crisp, compact sound. Snow lifts in sparkling heaps and lands to one side with soft thuds. The labour wakes the body more thoroughly than any cup of coffee could. Your shoulders engage. Breath deepens. Cold stings the cheeks. Steam rises from your mouth and from the horse of your own effort. The storm's silence remains, but now your shovel writes through it in regular strokes. One odd truth of prairie snow is that it can weigh almost nothing, and a great deal at once. The top powder moves like dry feathers. The lower packed drift feels like lifting fragments of a wall. Settlers learned quickly to read this difference with the shovel blade. A light fall might be brushed. A wind drift had to be fought. There is no elegant way to fight snow. You simply persist until a path exists where none existed before. Once the porch is manageable, you cut a line toward the barn. Each step sinks less after the first few, and a route begins to form. The air is calm now, so calm that every sound stands alone. The scrape of the shovel, the crunch of boots, a far faint creak from some loaded branch settling. Perhaps a horse calling softly from inside the barn, muted by walls and snow. Otherwise the world is held in white restraint. Morning chores after a storm could be demanding and urgent. Historians broadly agree that livestock care came first because delay meant real danger in severe cold. Yet scholars still debate how much such mornings differed from ordinary winter routines, because for many settlers harsh weather was ordinary winter routine. Disaster did not always announce itself as drama. Often it simply arrived as more labour before breakfast. At the barn you clear enough around the door to open it. Warm animal air meets you at once, thick with hay, hide, manure, and relief. The horse turns its head. The cow shifts and exhales. Chickens mutter from their corner with the offended dignity of creatures who consider all weather a managerial failure. Their presence is immensely comforting. Life continued in here while the storm raged out over the open fields, and that continuity steadies something in you. Water buckets need breaking and refilling. Hay must be shaken down. Grain is measured out. Hands move with simple, practiced purpose. The horse's coat feels warm and coarse beneath your palm. The cow smells earthy and sweet. The chickens bustle and scratch in their feathered little bureaucracy. One winter egg waits in the nesting straw, a small warm oval against all that cold morning. You pocket it carefully and feel absurdly grateful. There is often a special kind of satisfaction in the morning after a storm because survival appears ordinary. The roof stands, the animals breathe, the stove relights, the path is dug, nothing sings, no one makes speeches. This may be why frontier endurance is easy to romanticize and hard to describe accurately. It consisted less in constant heroics than in repeated uncelebrated competence. Back in the house, the stove has strengthened. The kettle steams more confidently, and breakfast scents begin to gather. Porridge, perhaps, made from oats or cornmeal, thickened slowly and salted lightly. Maybe yesterday's bread sliced and toasted near the fire. Maybe the new egg fried carefully in bacon fat. The room smells once again of useful warmth, and your gloves hanging by the stove release a damp wool scent as they dry from the shoveling. Snowmelt dots the floor near the door. The basin water catches a thread of light from the window. Day has properly entered. You set the egg in a bowl, stir the pot, and glance outside again. With the wind gone, the smoke from the stovepipe rises almost straight upward before leaning faintly east. That sight carries its own deep reassurance. The house is not battling now. It is simply living. Even the drifts look less threatening in daylight, more like work than menace. A curious detail preserved in some rural accounts is how children, and not only children, would rush to measure snowfall by fence rails, doorsteps, wagon wheels, or some trusted object in the yard. Snow depth became a kind of local language, part weather record and part morning entertainment. Official measurements mattered less to daily life than whether the drift reached the porch seat or buried the lower rail. Practical metrics are always the best ones. The breakfast is served plain and hot. You sit close to the stove and eat while steam rises from the bowl. The first spoonful warms your mouth and throat in a slow, spreading line. Toast crackles at the bite. The fried egg, if there is one, tastes rich of having arrived from a barn visited through drifts. Morning hunger after cold work is uncomplicated and very sincere. The body does not care for novelty. It cares for heat and substance. As you eat, light strengthens over the prairie. The sky clears by degrees, brightening from grey to a brittle winter blue. Sun finds the snowfields at an angle and turns them dazzling. What looked blank before now reveals slight ridges, carved drifts, delicate shadows along the porch steps and fence mounds. Beauty returns in more intricate form once the eye adjusts. The land seems almost ceremonial under its white cover, stern and luminous. Historians still argue over whether settlers eventually became accustomed to such scenes, or whether the scale and severity of prairie weather always retained some power to startle. Perhaps the answer is that people grew familiar with the labour and never entirely ceased to feel the wonder. Human beings can normalise hardship while remaining susceptible to light on snow. It is one of our better contradictions. You finish breakfast and sit for a moment longer with the bowl empty and hands wrapped around the last warmth of the cup. The house smells of porridge, toast, and smoke. Your muscles carry the pleasant fatigue of shoveling. Outside waits a morning of more clearing, more feeding, more practical work. Yet for this brief pause there is only the stove's steady murmur, the white brilliance beyond the window, and the quiet knowledge that the lonely homestead has come through another winter night. The prairie remains vast. The house remains small. Nothing about that has changed. But morning puts a gentler face on the balance. The storm is over. The drifts can be managed one shovel at a time. The animals are fed. The fire is alive. The day ahead is difficult only in ordinary ways, and ordinary ways are often the kindest kind. Now the pace of the room softens even further. The stove hums with a low, steady warmth. Outside, the white fields lie calm under the pale sun, each drift rounded and still, as if the land has finally exhaled. Your cup cools in your hands. The air smells of clean snow, faint smoke, and breakfast lingering near the table. The house no longer feels embattled. It feels tucked into the prairie like a small-held breath. You let your shoulders loosen. The chair supports you without complaint. The blankets on the bed wait in quiet folds. Light rests gently on the floorboards, on the basin rim, on the window frost that has begun to melt into silver threads. Somewhere in the barn, animals shift in their slow, contented rhythm. Nothing hurries. Nothing asks for more than the next simple task. Beyond the glass, the prairie stretches away in pure white silence, wide enough to empty the mind of its sharper edges. The drifts glow softly. The sky grows calmer by the minute, Even the cold seems less severe now, changed by daylight into something crisp and manageable, something that belongs to winter without trying to conquer the soul. You breathe in. Warmth from the stove reaches your hands and knees. The room is quiet enough for the smallest sounds to matter, a faint crackle in the fire, a tiny tick from the kettle, the whisper of your sleeve as you settle deeper into the chair. Each sound is gentle, each one belongs, and as the lonely homestead rests in the bright still morning, wrapped in snow, smoke, and pale winter light, you feel the long night loosen its hold completely. The storm has passed. The house endures. The prairie is silent again, vast and calm, and your thoughts drift with it, slower and softer, until even the work of the day seems far away. And all that remains is the peace of warmth inside, white silence outside, and the easy quiet of a winter morning that asks only that you rest a little longer.